Hello, Endeavor here. Recently, an all too familiar act of violence perpetrated against white children resulted in several weeks of unrest in the United Kingdom. An African teenager who was born in Wales entered a children's dance studio in Southport, Merseyside, and randomly stabbed to death 3 young girls and maimed a dozen other people. In the ensuing days, white Britons took to the streets, fed up with crimes being inflicted upon their children by those with migrant backgrounds and the anti-white double standards of the British government and media when it comes to interracial crimes. After the protests turned to riots and resulted in clashes with police and predominantly Muslim counter-protesters, the UK government cracked down on the so-called far right, putting an end to the unrest. Hundreds of white Brits have been arrested and summarily charged, convicted, and sentenced for their participation in the demonstrations or even posts on social media in support of them. The contrast between the British establishment's reaction to the BLM riots of 2020 versus those of the previous month have been revealing. They met unrest sparked by the death of a convicted criminal and drug addict in police custody in America with unwavering support in 2020, while meeting unrest sparked on by the brutal murder of 3 innocent children in their own country this year with cold disdain and condemnation. This glaring partiality has earned Prime Minister Keir Starmer the nickname Two-Tier Keir. The draconian crackdown and shameless double standard of the British government got many on social media to draw comparisons between present-day Britain and popular works of dystopian fiction. This is the most recent, but certainly not the first time, George Orwell's classic 1984 has been invoked by right-wing and centrist political commentators in response to the increasing authoritarianism of the political establishment in Britain and the West more broadly. In fact, this has been done so frequently that referencing George Orwell feels more like a tired cliché of contemporary discourse rather than insightful political commentary at this point. So I assure you, this video isn't going to be yet another comparison between modern Britain and 1984. Rather, I want to look at the phenomenon of dystopian fiction in the culture more broadly and the impacts it has had. It's not only right-wing dissidents who have taken a liking to the genre in recent years. It is one of the most popular genres out there today among readers across the political spectrum and has been for decades. I only got around to reading 1984 this year, but phrases like thought crime, ministry of truth, and memory hold have already been part of my lexicon for almost a decade now. We live in an age of increasing authoritarianism. Governments throughout the world have passed laws designed to jail citizens for non-violent political speech alone. Big tech companies have routinely banned users for simply expressing political views contrary to those of the company. Every single prestigious university or major corporation now requires ideological conformity among their staff under threat of termination. Governments and international bodies have identified quote-unquote misinformation, that being information they don't like, as the most serious global risk threatening the world today. There exist numerous organizations like the ADL or SPLC with hundreds of millions of dollars at their disposal to use for the sole purpose of defaming and deplatforming those whose views they deem unacceptable. And let us not forget that governments across the world forcibly shut down all public life for 2 years during the pandemic in response to a relatively mild illness. It's not only the influential institutions, but the people themselves who are becoming increasingly authoritarian in this regard. Several surveys have shown that a large portion of the population believes that certain kinds of speech should be forbidden online or on college campuses if it offends certain people. Some studies have suggested that young people are less likely to support free speech than older generations. It has become commonplace today for people to disown friends or family members with political views which differ from their own. And again, let's not forget how many ordinary citizens enthusiastically took it upon themselves to enforce government-issued restrictions during the pandemic. Is the popularity of dystopian literature today a function of a widespread sense that our world is beginning to reflect these works of fiction? I doubt it. Many hardcore progressives, the loudest enforcers of ideological orthodoxy, are themselves big fans of the genre. It's not difficult to imagine someone like Nina Jankowicz, the director of the Biden administration's short-lived Disinformation Governance Board, could have her own favorite dystopian fiction novel. And I guarantee, someone like her wouldn't see the slightest hint of irony in that. The joke, Orwell wrote 1984 as a warning, not an instruction manual, has been uttered so often in recent years that it has become stale. If the novel was written as a warning, it certainly hasn't succeeded in that goal. But it didn't fail because the book wasn't well written. I might not be too optimistic about its efficacy as a cautionary tale, but I still maintain that 1984 is a brilliantly written novel. It also didn't fail because people didn't read it. On the contrary, 1984 remains one of the most popular works of literature in the world today. Yet most people seem incapable of recognizing when the real world begins to resemble themes from the story. I personally know many people who this is applicable to, and I'm sure you do too. They repeat over and over how religion is used as a means of control. Meanwhile, these same people take the word of the mainstream media as if it were handed down by God himself, and are furious at the fact that it is possible to access alternative viewpoints on the internet. They frequently warn that dehumanizing others will lead to violence, yet many of them said that they wish the assassination attempt against Donald Trump had succeeded. They often preach that authoritarian governments use fear to take away people's rights. Yet during the pandemic, they were absolutely fanatical, demanding that the government enforce the harshest restrictions possible. And it's not just resentful, blue-haired, far-left activists who you'll hear this from either. Many of them are upper middle class, have had successful careers, have strong families, and are highly productive members of society overall. These well-rounded individuals aren't going to attain power or money off the continuation of the status quo. They actually have a lot to lose in the long run. How can otherwise intelligent people read of a totalitarian nightmare in a fictional novel and think of themselves as enlightened in doing so, while being totally incapable of applying that to the real world which they live in? What it comes down to is legitimacy. People read a novel like 1984 with the idea already in their mind that the world being described to them is dystopian. Big Brother is a fictional leader whose entire purpose in the story is to illustrate tyrannical rule. Thus, the regime of the story holds absolutely zero clout or credibility with the reader, making it easy for them to understand how abusive its rule is. However, in the real world, the media, the universities, the government, and corporations are viewed as legitimate sources of authority. Their word does carry a degree of clout and credibility, which is why many people accept it uncritically. The ideology of Ingsoc has no sway on the reader, not because the reader has carefully considered its tenets and concluded that they are wrong, but because it's presented as coming from an illegitimate authority. The reason the same reader can so uncritically accept and embrace the ideology of diversity, equity, and inclusion is because it is preached by an authority which they do consider legitimate. Again, they haven't rationally contemplated the veracity of this worldview, but simply accepted it on the basis of clout alone. Let's again look at the recent unrest and ensuing crackdown in the UK. How many aspects of this whole ordeal reflect themes from George Orwell's novel? Let's make a list. 1. Newspeak. The knife-wielding maniac who butchered multiple white children was referred to as Welsh in the media. Despite the fact his parents were from Rwanda, Welsh no longer means somebody who is ethnically Welsh, but anyone who was born in Wales. 2. The rewriting of history. Only a few decades ago, Britain was overwhelmingly white. However, the British establishment have taken to pushing the lie that Britain has always been diverse in order to hide the effects of their immigration policies. 3. The memory hole. The recent unrest was spurred on by a brutal crime committed against British children, but this was only in the media for a few days before the narrative shifted to the threat posed by the so-called far right, overshadowing the crime itself. 4. 2 minutes hate. The British establishment has now spent weeks fear-mongering about the so-called far right, using them as a boogeyman for whom all the blame for the failures of multiculturalism can be placed. 5. Doublethink. The entire British establishment were literally on their knees in support of unrest in 2020, spurred on by the death of a black man in America, but have cracked down ruthlessly on unrest spurred on by the death of 3 white children in their own country. 6. Thought crime. Hundreds of people have been arrested in relation to the ordeal. Some of them were arrested for nothing more than expressing views critical of immigration or in support of the demonstrations on social media. I'm sure I could go on, but you get the point. And this is just one event I'm referring to here. How many parallels could be drawn between 1984 and the pandemic, or any other number of happenings of the past decade? Again, I don't wish to pass this observation off as a stroke of intellectual brilliance on my part. It's already been said countless times before. The point is that, as glaringly obvious as this observation is, it still doesn't prevent a large portion of the population, many of whom have no doubt read the novel before, from clapping along as it plays out in the real world. The misconception is that people are these rational actors who will objectively analyze the system which governs their society and come to a well-reasoned conclusion as to whether it is just or not. The reality is that for the majority of people, authority will always supersede their ability to think critically about any given subject. They may shudder in fear when they read of the misdeeds of cartoonishly evil parodies of long discredited regimes of the past century, but when the institutions which they actually do grant legitimacy to act in a similar way, don't expect them to wake up. If you're still not convinced of how ineffective dystopian literature is at preventing real-world dystopia, consider this. Last year, feminist author Sandra Newman published a feminist retelling of 1984 from the perspective of Julia, Winston Smith's lover. I kid you not. Even 1984, the most famous work of dystopian fiction ever written, is now being reimagined in order to bring it in line with the zeitgeist of the present day. And if that's not bad enough, George Orwell's estate actually gave their approval to the project. Even those entrusted with the legacy of George Orwell himself see nothing Orwellian about forcing present-day political doctrine into a story about the dangers of doctrinarism. Even they are true believers in the modern world's version of Ingsoc. I'll also add that works of fiction in the genre seem incapable of imagining a manifestation of tyranny which doesn't resemble historical regimes from the 1930s, such as National Socialist Germany or the Stalinist Soviet Union. I can forgive Orwell for this since he wrote his novel as a critique of Stalinism, which still existed at the time of writing, but over 75 years later, we're still using the same tired and outdated point of reference for totalitarianism in our culture today. Almost every fictional dystopia is still derivative of some regime from the past century. Not only does this result in boring and unimaginative storytelling in the genre, but it also serves to obfuscate the true essence of totalitarianism in favor of surface-level trivialities. The implication is that a society can only be dystopian if it is ruled by an all-powerful leader and has political slogans and iconography plastered everywhere as far as the eye can see. That's the full extent to which a lot of people can even conceptualize totalitarianism. They can only grasp the aesthetics, but none of the substance. Winston Smith, the lead character of 1984, told himself, "If there is hope, it lies in the proles," in hopes that one day the underclass will rise up and overthrow Big Brother and the ruling party. I don't share his faith in the normie. Not only will they not rise up and overthrow an oppressive and all-controlling tyranny, they usually won't even realize that they're living under one. So fictional stories of nightmarish dystopian futures do not prevent those same nightmares from playing out in the real world. Perhaps a number of politically active individuals have taken a liking to the genre as a result of a sense that Western countries are headed in a totalitarian direction. However, that can't be the full explanation for its popularity, since the zealots of the reigning orthodoxy are often big fans of the genre as well. So that brings me back to the question from earlier: why is dystopian fiction so popular today? Is it just because the setting of a theoretical totalitarian regime makes for good storytelling? I think that's part of it, but I also think there's something else at play here too. I recall a few years back, my friend and fellow YouTuber Fritz Imperial posted the following quote on Twitter: "The real dystopia was created by fighting fake dystopias." The unrest in the United Kingdom, the subsequent crackdown, and the comparisons made with dystopian literature on social media had me thinking about this quotation. It's not only classics like 1984 or Brave New World which are popular today. Many such stories have been produced and heavily promoted by the mainstream in more recent decades. For example, there's The Handmaid's Tale, the 1985 novel which was adapted into a TV series by Hulu in 2017. This series tells the story of a Christian fundamentalist future United States where women are enslaved, mandated to wear long red robes and white hoods, and forcibly impregnated in internment camps by misogynistic white men in suits. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that this series is essentially the paranoid delusions of feminists during the Trump era put onto a TV screen. How about Watchdog Legions, Ubisoft's open-world action game released in 2020? This game is set in London after the UK has been taken over by an isolationist fascist regime governed by a PMC called Albion and their CEO Nigel Cass. The regime proceeds to stage a terrorist attack in order to implement a mass surveillance system, detain immigrants en masse, and cut Britain off from the rest of the world. The game's attempt at doom-mongering over the outcome of the Brexit referendum is about as subtle as a sledgehammer. But the most egregious example which I know of is the 2005 film V for Vendetta, based on Alan Moore's graphic novel of the same title. The movie is set in London in a near future after the UK is taken over by a totalitarian, Christian fundamentalist, neo-fascist, white supremacist regime, ruled by a political party known as Norsefire. Under this regime, immigrants, Muslims, and homosexuals are interned in concentration camps and experimented on. A mass surveillance grid tracks people's every movement. Jackbooted armed troops patrol the streets and enforce curfews, and any criticism of the regime is punishable by death. Our heroes include V, an anonymous violent revolutionary who dons a Guy Fawkes mask and carries out assassinations and terrorist attacks. Evie, a young woman whose parents were executed by the regime for their seditious activism. Gordon, a closeted gay TV host with a secret collection of contraband including a copy of the Quran and homoerotic images. And Valerie, a lesbian who was interned for her sexuality, experimented on, and executed in a concentration camp. Our villains include High Chancellor Sutler, a cartoonishly evil, one-dimensional totalitarian dictator who screams every single line of dialogue. The Bishop of London, a priest attracted to underage girls who has them delivered to him on command. The Voice of London, a TV propagandist who is broadcast throughout the city shouting political doctrine at the camera. Creedy, the power-hungry leader of Britain's fascistic secret police. And Chief Inspector Finch, the detective assigned to identifying and capturing V. The movie begins with Evie being caught violating curfew by the fascist secret police who attempt to coerce her into performing sexual favors before she's rescued by V. He then recites the Remember, Remember the 5th of November poem, the date which it happens to be, before detonating a bomb which destroys the Old Bailey in London. The following day, V breaks into a TV station where Evie works and broadcasts a message declaring that there will be a revolution 1 year hence on November 5th, during which he will blow up the House of Parliament building as Guy Fawkes attempted to in 1605. Now accused of being V's accomplice, Evie is forced to go into hiding with him. V proceeds to assassinate a number of high-ranking members of the Norsefire party. Chief Inspector Finch is assigned to the case, but during his investigation he uncovers a conspiracy. He learns that the St. Mary virus, which had gripped the nation years earlier, was actually created in a concentration camp and deliberately released by the Norsefire party to justify totalitarian rule. V sends out hundreds of thousands of Guy Fawkes masks to citizens in London, along with a message to take to the streets to witness the destruction of the House of Parliament on the 5th of November. He rigs a bomb to an old train line which runs under Parliament. V makes a deal with Creedy to turn himself in exchange for killing High Chancellor Sutler, who Creedy will replace. After Sutler is dead, V kills Creedy and his men, but is mortally wounded in the fight. Evie loads his body onto the train rigged with the bombs. Finch discovers the rig, but allows Evie to initiate it, having learned of the conspiracy behind the St. Mary's virus. The House of Parliament blows up as thousands wearing Guy Fawkes masks look on, and the regime falls. I could point out some of the many logical inconsistencies with the story. Like, for example, why does V, a revolutionary fighting a totalitarian Christo-fascist regime, choose Guy Fawkes as his icon, when the real Guy Fawkes was a radical Catholic whose motive for planning the gunpowder plot was to restore a Catholic monarch to the throne of England? Why does Gordon, a gay man persecuted by Christian fundamentalism, have such an affinity for the Quran that he secretly keeps a copy hidden in his house at risk of punishment by death? Why does London in this theoretical totalitarian future from 2005 look nicer than London does in the real world in 2024? Unlike London today, in the movie the city looks clean, high-tech, well-run, and the family which is intended to represent average people is shown living in an apartment which, in reality, would cost a fortune in London. I could also point out how lazy, unimaginative, and on-the-nose the political messaging of the movie is. The main villain's full name is Adam Sutler, a blatantly obvious derivative of a certain early 20th century Austrian painter. He's constantly shown alongside fascistic political banners, screaming in front of a crowd of jackbooted troops with rifles. Again, an obvious caricature of the Nuremberg rallies. And what work of multiculturalist propaganda would be complete without images of famished human corpses littered about a concentration camp? There's also the ham-fisted and unoriginal manner in which the film comments on the political issues of its time, such as the religious right, the war on terror, the gay marriage debate, and the perception of Islam following 9/11. All of which feels incredibly forced. I could also bring up how, in order to avoid contradicting the narratives which the film wants to push, there's no mention at all of Guy Fawkes' deeply held religious beliefs which served as his motive for the gunpowder plot. His desire to return England to Catholicism is never once addressed in the movie. It only mentions the fact that he tried to blow up the House of Parliament. What the film glorifies is not the conviction of a man like Guy Fawkes, but simply the nihilism of wanton destruction. But what really stands out about V for Vendetta is how the fictional dystopian Britain depicted in this libtard power fantasy is the mere opposite of the reality of British society today. It's not white Christian fascists who are put on national television to spew political diatribe. It's anti-white, black and brown ethno-narcissists. It's not white Christian fascists systemically sexually abusing young girls with the complicity of the authorities. It's gangs of Pakistani Muslims. It's not white Christian fascists who are coercing people, including children, into twisted body-altering medical procedures. It's lesbian, homosexual, and transgender rights activists. It's not white Christian fascists who make walking the streets of London at night unsafe. It's knife-wielding black teenagers. It's not white Christian fascists rewriting the works of Ian Fleming, Roald Dahl, and Agatha Christie to fit their political ideology. It's radical feminists and anti-racist ideologues. It wasn't white Christian fascists who colluded with Big Pharma to use a virus as a pretext for greatly expanding the power of the state. It was progressive liberal globalists. It's not white Christian fascists who are arresting people for simply expressing a political opinion. It's a government which lauds diversity, equity, and inclusion as their highest values. V for Vendetta imagines a dystopian future where England is controlled by a far-right, white supremacist, Christian fundamentalist, totalitarian regime. It's the producer's lazy and uncreative way of fear-mongering about an ethnically homogenous, culturally Christian, socially conservative England. However, we don't need to imagine what such a place would look like. It existed just a few decades ago, before multiculturalism. And back then, there were no grooming gangs, puberty blockers, acid attacks, stabbing sprees, nudge units, or thought police in England. In other words, the values which V for Vendetta attempts to pathologize as dystopian and totalitarian are those of the England of 1948. The England in which George Orwell wrote 1984. This was the societal context which Orwell had in mind when he set out to illustrate a dystopian nightmare so alien to the reader they would shudder in fear just picturing the existence of such a place. And we also don't need to imagine what England would look like if it were controlled by the so-called heroes of the film. It's England today, with all the aforementioned horrors. Media such as V for Vendetta, The Handmaid's Tale, and Watchdog Legion serves the same function in today's world which the 2 Minutes Hate served in Oceania in 1984. In Orwell's novel, party members are required to routinely sit through a film denouncing Emmanuel Goldstein, the ideological enemy of Big Brother, and either Eurasia or East Asia, depending on who they are at war with at the time. They are encouraged to unleash their hatred of the enemies of Big Brother by shouting and throwing objects at the screen in disgust. These fictional dystopias serve the same purpose for present-day progressives. The only difference is that instead of ginning the audience up into a frenzy in which they scream and lob items at their TVs, they conjure an internal sense of self-righteous moral superiority in the viewer. It's also worth noting the real-world figures which served as the inspiration for these pieces of dystopian fiction. Watchdog's Legion is inspired by Nigel Farage and the results of the 2016 Brexit referendum. The Handmaid's Tale TV series was made during the Trump administration, and the novel which it's based on was made during the presidency of Ronald Reagan. V for Vendetta makes allusions to the war on terror and the religious right, both of which played a large part in the presidency of George W. Bush, and the graphic novel which it is based on was, in part, a commentary on Margaret Thatcher's prime ministership of the UK. Each of these works of media allude to popular right-wing figures in the US and UK over the past 50 years. As a right-winger myself, I would regard each of these figures as controlled opposition. Nigel Farage won his Brexit referendum, and Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, George Bush, and Donald Trump all served terms in office, yet none of them have reversed or really even held back the progressive drift of the politics of their countries over that period of time. As to why, I'm of the belief that their critiques of liberalism were simply surface level, and at their core, they remained liberal egalitarians in accordance with the post-war consensus. If they were in fact genuine in their beliefs, that would mean that they lacked the fortitude to use their power to push back against the slide to where we are today in any meaningful way. In other words, they were the furthest thing from a strongman tyrant with the will to claim absolute authority. However, these works of fiction build these individuals up to be the second coming of Austrian Mustache Man. What this does is create a constant state of paranoia among leftists and liberals that anything remotely right-wing will inevitably give rise to a fascistic totalitarian regime where supposed victim groups are hauled off to concentration camps. This galvanizes them into a perpetual state of hysteria under which they're prepared to go nuclear over the slightest deviation from progressive orthodoxy. This is the same paranoia which has given us cancel culture, Antifa, and Trump derangement syndrome, something the entertainment industry has played no small part in creating. It should come as no surprise when fans of media like V for Vendetta cheer on with glee as the British government hands down prison sentences to working-class English people over posts they made on social media. The message of the film is not that authoritarianism, censorship, and political violence are bad in and of themselves. The message is that if any worldview contrary to the progressive egalitarian fantasy is ever allowed to see the light of day, it is bound to result in a genocidal totalitarian dystopia, and that any amount of authoritarianism, censorship, and political violence is justified in preventing that from happening. Communist regimes of the 20th century legitimized themselves by portraying capitalist countries as oppressive, unjust, and impoverished in their propaganda. The entertainment industry has done the same for the ruling universalist egalitarian ideology of the present day. By demonizing any and every alternative as irredeemably evil, they've created a zealous ideological vanguard on a never-ending witch hunt for wrong-thinkers, creating a perpetual state of terror throughout public life in the Western world. That's how fighting fake dystopias created a real one. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. You can follow me on X or Telegram, and I also publish exclusive content on Substack. If you'd like to make a donation, Substack will be the place to do that. All links are down below. Thank you for listening. Till next time, Endeavor.